He commanded an entire army. Tens of thousands of men looked to him for leadership, depended on his decisions, followed his orders into battle. He bore responsibility for vast operations, for the success or failure of campaigns, for the lives of all the men under his command. He was a general, one of the senior commanders of the war, a man whose duty demanded that he send others into danger, knowing that some would not return. And then, in the midst of all this, in the midst of commanding an army at war, General Alexander Patch received the news that every parent dreads above all else. His son, a young officer serving in the same war, had been killed in action. This is the story of a commander who carried the universal burden of war and also the most personal grief imaginable, of a father who lost his son even as he led an army, and of the quiet, dignified strength with which he bore an almost unbearable weight. This is a story about the human cost of war, about the way that war touches even those who command it, bringing grief and loss that no rank can shield against. It is a story about the particular burden of a commander who was also a father, who sent other men's sons into battle, and then lost his own. And it is a story about dignity and grief, about the quiet strength of a man who bore a terrible personal loss while continuing to fulfill his duty, who carried both the weight of command and the weight of a father's sorrow. To understand the poignancy of this story, you have to understand the dual role that General Patch occupied as both a senior commander and a father. As a general commanding an army, Patch bore enormous responsibilities. He was charged with leading tens of thousands of men, with planning and executing operations, with making the decisions that would determine the success of campaigns and the fate of the men under his command. This was a heavy burden in itself, the responsibility for an army at war, for the lives of so many men, for the outcome of operations that could cost thousands of lives. Patch carried this burden as part of his duty as a commander. But Patch was also a father, and his son was serving in the same war that he was helping to wage. This was not uncommon. Many fathers and sons served in the war, and the families of those in command were not exempt from the dangers of combat. Patch's son was a young officer, serving his country as his father did, exposed to the same dangers that all those in combat faced. For Patch, this meant that he carried not only the general burden of command, but also the personal anxiety of a father whose son was in harm's way, who knew that his own child faced the dangers of war. This dual role, as commander and father, gave his experience a particular poignancy. The dangers of war did not spare the families of commanders, and Patch's son was killed in action, falling in the same conflict that his father was helping to lead. This was the realization of every parent's worst fear, the loss of a child, made all the more poignant by the circumstances. Patch, a general commanding an army, a man responsible for sending others into battle, lost his own son to the war. The news of his son's death brought to him the most personal and devastating grief, even as he continued to bear the responsibilities of command. It was a convergence of the universal burden of war and the most personal of losses. Now we should be honest about the history here, because the loss that General Patch suffered is a real and documented part of the history of the war, a genuine instance of the personal cost that war exacted even from those in command. What follows is grounded in this genuine history, though we will tell it as a narrative to convey its full human meaning. The core is true. General Patch was a senior American commander. His son was a young officer serving in the war, and his son was killed, bringing the general the most personal grief even as he continued to fulfill his duties. The details are recounted to convey the human dimension of this loss and the dignity with which Patch bore it. Consider the situation that Patch faced upon receiving the news of his son's death. He was in the midst of commanding an army at war, bearing all the responsibilities that this entailed. He could not simply set aside his duties to grieve, could not withdraw from his command to mourn his son. The war continued. His army needed his leadership. The responsibilities of command pressed upon him. And yet he had suffered a devastating personal loss, the death of his own son. He had to find a way to bear this grief while continuing to fulfill his duty, to carry the weight of his sorrow while still leading his army. It was a situation that demanded extraordinary strength and dignity. The way that Patch bore this burden, by all accounts, reflected a quiet dignity and strength. He did not allow his personal grief to prevent him from fulfilling his responsibilities. He continued to command his army, to carry out his duties, even as he bore the terrible weight of his son's death. This was not a matter of suppressing or denying his grief, but of carrying it with dignity while continuing to do what duty required. The strength that this demanded, the ability to bear such a personal loss while continuing to command, reflects a remarkable depth of character and a profound sense of duty. There is something deeply moving about the image of a commander bearing such a personal loss while continuing to lead. Patch was responsible for an army, for the lives of tens of thousands of men, many of whom were also someone's son. He had sent men into battle, knowing that some would die, that other families would receive the same terrible news that he now received. And now he had joined the ranks of those who had lost a loved one to the war, had experienced the grief that he had, in a sense, helped to bring to other families. This convergence of his role as a commander and his experience as a grieving father gave his loss a particular depth and meaning. What does this story reveal about the human cost of war? First and foremost, it reveals that war exacts a personal toll even from those who command it, that no rank or position shields against the grief and loss that war brings. We sometimes think of generals as removed from the human cost of war, as figures who direct operations from a distance, insulated from the suffering that war causes. But Patch's experience reveals the falseness of this image. He suffered the most personal and devastating loss, the death of his own son, just as countless other families did. War touched him as a father, bringing him the same grief that it brought to so many others. The human cost of war reached even to the highest levels of command. The story also reveals the particular burden borne by commanders who were also parents of those serving, the dual anxiety and responsibility that they carried. Patch bore not only the general responsibility of command, but also the personal anxiety of a father whose son was in danger. This dual burden, this convergence of professional responsibility and personal concern, was a heavy weight to carry. And when his son was killed, the two dimensions of his experience converged in the most painful way as the war that he was helping to wage claimed his own child. This particular burden, borne by commanders who were also parents, is a poignant aspect of the human cost of war. Consider, too, what this story teaches about dignity and strength in the face of grief. Patch bore his loss with a quiet dignity, continuing to fulfill his duties even as he carried the weight of his son's death. This dignity, this strength, is deeply admirable. It would have been understandable for a man to be overwhelmed by such a loss, to be unable to continue. But Patch found the strength to bear his grief while continuing to lead, to carry his sorrow with dignity while fulfilling his responsibilities. This reflects a remarkable depth of character, a profound strength that allowed him to endure an almost unbearable loss while continuing to do his duty. There is a broader lesson here about the way that duty and grief can coexist, about the strength required to continue fulfilling one's responsibilities in the face of personal tragedy. Patch could not set aside his duty to grieve, but had to find a way to carry both his responsibilities and his sorrow. This is a situation that many people face, in various forms, the need to continue fulfilling their obligations even in the midst of personal grief. Patch's example, his ability to bear his loss with dignity while continuing to lead, offers a model of how to carry both duty and grief, of the strength that allows one to continue even in the face of devastating personal loss. It is worth reflecting on the universality of the grief that Patch experienced, the way that his loss connected him to countless other families touched by the war. Patch was a general, a senior commander, but in his grief he was simply a father who had lost his son, experiencing the same sorrow that so many other parents experienced. His loss connected him to all the other families who had received the same terrible news, who had lost sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers to the war. In this sense, his experience embodied the universal human cost of war, the grief that touched families across all nations and all ranks, the sorrow that war brought to so many. Consider as well the way that this story humanizes the figure of the commander, revealing the man behind the rank. We often think of generals in terms of their military roles, their strategies and decisions and campaigns. But Patch's loss reveals the human being behind the commander, the father who loved his son and grieved his death. This humanization is important, for it reminds us that the commanders of the war were human beings, with families and loves and griefs, not merely figures directing operations. Patch's loss reveals his humanity, his vulnerability to the deepest grief, the human heart beneath the general's uniform. The story of General Patch and the loss of his son also stands as a reminder of the countless personal tragedies that the war encompassed, the individual losses that together made up the immense human cost of the conflict. The war was not just a matter of grand strategy and great battles, but of countless individual lives, countless personal losses, countless families touched by grief. Patch's loss was one of these countless tragedies, one family's grief among millions. His story reminds us to remember the human dimension of the war, the individual lives and losses that the larger history can sometimes obscure, the personal tragedies that were the true cost of the conflict. There is also something to be learned here about compassion for those who bear heavy burdens, about recognizing the human struggles that lie behind positions of responsibility. Patch bore his grief quietly, continuing to fulfill his duties, and those around him might not have fully appreciated the weight he carried. This reminds us that people in positions of responsibility often bear heavy burdens that are not visible, that behind the outward fulfillment of duty there may be profound personal struggles and griefs. It calls us to compassion for those who carry such burdens, to recognition of the human struggles that may lie behind the roles that people fulfill. The story of General Patch bearing the loss of his son while continuing to command his army stands as a poignant illustration of the human cost of war and the dignity with which that cost can be borne. It reveals that war touches even those who command it, bringing grief and loss that no rank can shield against. It reveals the particular burden of a commander who was also a grieving father, and it reveals the quiet strength and dignity with which a man can bear an almost unbearable loss while continuing to fulfill his duty. It stands as a moving testament to the human dimension of the war and the strength of those who endured its costs. By the time the war ended, General Patch had borne his personal loss while continuing to serve, fulfilling his duties as a commander, even as he carried the grief of a father who had lost his son. His experience stood as one of the countless personal tragedies of the war, a reminder that the conflict's immense human cost reached even to the highest levels of command. And the dignity with which he bore his loss stood as a testament to the strength of character that allowed him to carry both the weight of command and the weight of a father's grief, continuing to do his duty even in the face of the most devastating personal loss. So remember General Patch, the commander who bore the most personal grief even as he led an army at war. Remember that he carried the dual burden of a commander and a father, responsible for the lives of tens of thousands of men while his own son served in the same war. Remember that his son was killed in action, bringing him the most devastating loss even as he continued to fulfill his duties. And remember the quiet dignity and strength with which he bore this burden, continuing to command his army while carrying the weight of a father's grief. His story stands as a poignant reminder of the human cost of war, of the grief that touches even those who command, and of the profound strength required to bear such a loss with dignity while continuing to serve.